Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
So we were able to, I called a gentleman, and he said he'd just be happier in hell to come out here. He'd never been to Oregon. You know, they said when I drank, I suffered from little man's disease. Anybody my stature knows what that problem is. And if I just suffered from it, this guy must have had it terminally, because he's shorter than I am. This time I'd like to introduce Keith L. from Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Thank you very much. My name is Keith Lewis, and I am a grateful alcoholic. And I do live in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I now call that my home. It's a privilege for a guy like me to have a place that he calls home. I want to thank you for having me to your wonderful Summerfest conference, and I want to thank you for inviting me to your beautiful town and it's a wonderful state. It's just spectacular. I was told by one Oregon resident that they invited all the people from out of state on the one nice weekend, but I don't believe that. I'm just kidding. I've never been a place where people were so proud of where they live, and I think you have every right to be. And I congratulate you and God on the wonderful job you've done here. I want to thank those folks who were kind enough to invite me. It's always a privilege to come and speak at a conference. I'd like to thank the members of my home group, the little group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We used to think that we called it a little group because there weren't many members, but the real reason is that we don't allow tall mutants in that group. Members of that group have prayed for me all week, and I thank them. They really do. They support me with their prayers and their honest feedback if they see me getting off track. I also want to thank my partner in prayer, a man named Mike W., who works in Washington, D.C., and lives in a little place where a lot of prayer happens in the mountains of West Virginia. And I'd like to thank my lovely fiancée, Julie, who is praying for me this very moment. She always does when I go someplace. I question her judgment, but I am eternally grateful for her support. I want to thank the three gentlemen who were sober 39 years, and I want to thank the young lady who's got less than a day. And I want to say I'm grateful to be somewhere in the middle. And I'm somewhere in the middle because of people like you. I was told that when I come to talk, I'm supposed to do what it says in the book, and that is tell you a little bit about how it was and how I got here and what it's like now. And I'm going to attempt to do that. I suffer from a disease that by now should have killed me, but for the grace of God. And one of the things that I hear around AA so often, and I certainly have been guilty of saying, is that I've never seen a burning bush. What I know is that my whole life there were burning bushes. Right now I'm in a room with, and this weekend I've spent a weekend with somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people who are burning bushes because things have happened to us that aren't supposed to happen. And I know that a burning bush is miraculous, and I know that a miracle is something that can't be explained. And I don't believe any of us can be explained. And as I sat here this morning and listened to the countdown, I just fill up with tears. I'm just so grateful that God has delivered to us this magnificent thing that isn't supposed to happen. And so I've seen burning bushes. I've seen burning bushes that mean more to me than the burning bush that others see. The pity is that there was one time when I had neither the eyes to see it nor the ears to hear it. And that to me is the bottom line of my alcoholism. What I have is a disease that's spiritual in nature that doesn't allow me to see the most beautiful thing in the world, and that is the love that has surrounded me my whole life. I'm one of those people who was born a little bit different. I didn't know I was different. Different people don't know they're different. They're just different. I thought everybody was like me in a way, and then I thought everybody was different than me. I kind of had this feeling that everybody knew what was going on but me. And my job was to sort of hang around and watch you and to try to do what you did. And it was as though somewhere along the line God set everybody down in a big room, something like this one, and He explained to everybody what it was about. He explained what it was like to grow up, what it was like to be a real man, what it was like to get a real woman, what it was like to be in love, and what it was like to raise a family. And He explained all these things, and I was in the bathroom. And I was the only one who wasn't there. And I couldn't let you know I wasn't there because I watched you, and all my life I watched you. I looked in your eyes and I watched you, and you guys looked so confident. I mean, I remember looking at you saying, now there are some people who know what's going on. I mean, there are some people who know the big picture. And I just had little pieces of the picture. And it wasn't until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous that I found out you didn't know what the hell was going on either, that nobody knew what was going on. And that was really comforting. And we could just sort of feel our way along together. I'm not different than a lot of people here. I'm the second oldest in a family of 10 children. I'm Irish. I won't tell you what church I went to. I'll let you sort of gather as you go along. I was born and raised in the Ohio Valley, a little town called Martins Ferry, Ohio, which is down on the Ohio River, just south of Pittsburgh. I had my first drink when I was 5 years of age. I think that drink was significant. My father was watching us, my brother Denny and I. Denny was 4 and I was 5, and we were sitting around the kitchen table, and my mother was out. I don't know, she was either at a bingo or having a baby or doing something. And we were sitting around the kitchen table, and my father poured us each a beer. I never forget it. I had alcoholic grandparents, and so neither of my parents ever drank much. They were always kind of afraid of it. And but there was some beer in the refrigerator, and my father got the little glasses, those little jelly glasses, had the cartoon heroes on them, and he gave me the one with Superman on. I don't know if that's significant, but he gave us each a beer. It was probably an Iron City. I don't know. I can't remember, but we were sitting there and we drank them, and I remember I was fine, but I looked over at Denny, and Denny's sliding down out of the chair, and he's rolling around under the table singing "Mary Had a Little Lamb" and other drinking songs, and my father got a little bit excited, and he wrestled him to the ground, and he put his pajamas on him, and I went and got my pajamas on. The kind with the trap door and the feet, he said, "I want you to go to bed." He said, "Don't say anything to your mother about this, and I'll take you to the movies." Well, I was a nice kid. I wanted to go along with the program, but Denny wasn't hearing it. Denny was carrying on and laughing, and finally we were up in our little cribs, and I was fortunate I was across the room from him, and I was watching him. It was disgusting. He stood up in his little crib and he urinated on the floor. And I remember laying over there watching this horrible thing, and I remember saying something like, there's a kid who's powerless over alcohol and whose life has become a menace. The saddest thing happened. It was awful. I'll never forget as long as I live. We're kind of ashamed of it. That kid went on and did some really embarrassing and disgusting things. He went to college, and which isn't bad, but he went to one college, and he had one major, and if my parents knew I was telling this, they'd be mortified. But he graduated on time. He went to one graduate school, graduated on time. He looked around, and he chose one corporation, large corporation. I was just up visiting him. He lives in Detroit now, and he's a vice president in charge of sales at AT&T. And the most disgusting thing at all, this month, 18 years ago, he married one woman. You know, there's a kid who had the world in the palm of his hand when he was 4 years old, and he let it slip away. I don't understand. Last year he came to North Carolina and played in an AA golf tournament that we have, and the following week he played in a member guest tournament at my club, and he said to me, I went up this year and we went down to Akron. He's a member at Firestone, and we played Firestone a couple of days, and he told me, he said, you know, he said, I really like playing in your member guest. He said, but I love playing in the AA tournament. He said, we met two guys you never knew on the first tee. And he said, by the time you got to the fourth tee, you were calling each other names that I don't call my friends I've known for 20 years. He said, I've never seen such closeness and intimacy between strangers. And I told him that if he hadn't been stuck on one, he could have had that. The other thing I remember about being small and young was that I was scared a lot. I didn't know that you were scared. I didn't know Barney was scared. I figured a guy like Barney wouldn't be scared. I mean, he's big and he's smart. He could sweat like a real man. You know? I didn't think anybody like Polly would be scared. You know, she's a beautiful woman and sensitive and has such a wonderful message. But she said she was scared. Heather said she was scared. She seemed so confident and sure of herself. And I thought I was the only one who was scared. And I had a good reason to be scared, because there was something lived under my bed. Now, I don't know about your bed, but in my bed, when the lights were out, you could lay there and press your ear against the mattress, and you'd hear it moving around down there. And I always knew that it was going to get me if I got too close to the edge of the bed. And the way I knew that was if you wake up in the morning, you could see those marks on the sheets where it reached up. And so I used to spend a lot of my nights just laying in the center of the bed, concentrating on being real thin. And just practicing terror. I mean, everybody else went to sleep, and I just lay there being afraid. And I knew that if it ever got me, that I'd never come back. I knew that, and the reason I knew that was I was an observant little kid, and I watched and I listened, and I never met a little kid who had got and came back. So I knew that if it got me, it was all over, and of course I kept it a secret. You just didn't talk about those things in my house. I remember once I told my parents I was afraid of the lightning and the thunder, and they said, "That's silly." And so I went back into my room and felt guilty because I felt silly because I was terrified of the lightning and the thunder. And so I learned at a pretty early age that you keep this stuff to yourself. You keep these things to yourself. That's the way it is. You don't tell anybody. I also learned at an early age that we were very poor. Very poor. And that's the reason I was the way I was. Because we were very poor. And there's another reason that I was the way I was. And that is my father never told me he loved me. And that's the reason I was the way I was. That's why I turned into a wife abuser, why I ended up drinking in bootleg joints on 14th Street, and on and on and on. Let me tell you about that father who never told me he loved me. You talk about spiritual illness. Incredible. You know, my father is 75 years old, and he lives, I have a little house down in Carolina Beach in North Carolina. If you ever get down there, it's on the ocean, and you'll see a sign on a house, 600 block of Carolina Avenue South, and it says, "Seasy does it." And stop by and see these horrible people who raised me if you get a chance. They love it when my friends in AA come by, and my mother will make you eat and make you drink iced tea, and then you'll have to listen to more stories about when I was a kid than you want to hear. But if I go there, I will go and I'll spend a night, and about 20 minutes after I'm in bed, this horrible man will come by and knock on the door, and he'll say, do you have enough blankets? I don't care if it's August. He says, "You have enough blankets?" And I'll say, "Yes, Dad." And he'll say, "Did you say your prayers?" I say, "Yes, Dad." "Well, good night." "Good night, Dad." And you know, he never told me he loved me. And you know, he'd come home from the factory when he was where he worked, and he'd be soaked with oil and chips. He was a machinist, and steel stuck in his fingers and all that business. And we'd get together and we'd pray as a family, and then we would eat. And I'd watch my parents. I didn't think parents ate with kids. I thought parents ate after kids. And I realize now it was because they wanted to make sure that we had enough to eat before they ate. And then my father would wash up, and then he would take my brother Denny and myself, and we'd head up to the old mill field, which was a place we used for a baseball field. It was next to a steel mill. And we would stay there as long as the light would allow. And we'd come back, and we'd be walking up the tracks, and they had little streetcar diners by the mill that the men would stop and coming and going. And we'd say, "Dad, we have a pop. So glad to be back in Oregon where they know what to call it." And in the South they call it soda, and I never know if Scotch is coming with it or what. And I'd say, Dad, could we have a pop? And I always had an orange, and Denny always had a grape, and my father always had a root beer. And he'd look in his pocket, and he'd drop back a little bit, and he'd look in his pocket. And sometimes we'd order an orange and a grape and a root beer, and sometimes we'd just order an orange and a grape. And they never told me he loved me. I had a mother who never finished high school until all 10 of her children had, and went back and finished high school. And a woman would be up most nights because she ironed all these shirts, and she made sandwiches for lunches, looked like a dealer in Las Vegas. And I never remember a day that she didn't hug us if we let her, and kiss us if we let her, and tell us that she loved us. But we were poor. See, that was my problem. My problem is we were poor, and we didn't have a car, and some of the other kids had cars, and we didn't have a television set. So we had to do poor things. We had to have a reading hour when we weren't permitted to read anything that was school-related. We had to learn to read for the sake of learning something. My mother had an incredible love for poetry, and I could quote Gunga Din and the Gettysburg Address and all that business before I was 10 years of age. And she had a love for classical music, and she had old Caruso records, and we would play operas. We were poor, and frequently the radio didn't work, so we had to act out plays in the living room. And we had block rosaries, and we prayed together every night because we were poor. And I'm here to tell you that I lived in a beautiful little house on the golf course, and I owned part of my own business. And I own a house on the ocean that my parents stay in. And I have brothers who are vice presidents in large corporations, a number of brothers and sisters who have gone on to college and on and on and on. And I'm here to report that I was the wealthiest kid that ever lived. And I never knew that because I didn't have the eyes to see or the ears to hear. Because I had a disease called alcoholism that's spiritual in nature that would not allow me to see the incredible love that was all around me. And that's what strikes me about this illness more than anything else. That's what's more horrible about this illness than anything else. That's why I hate the illness, because it takes beautiful human beings like me and convinces them that they live in a horrible place where there's no love. And it convinces them that everybody's against them and that it's been done to them. And it doesn't allow them to see the myriad of beauty and sacrifice that surrounded us. You know, I was always afraid, and I graduated from high school. I was 5 feet 1 inches tall, and I weighed 113 pounds. So I did the only thing a guy like me could do. I went over and joined the Marine Corps. And I got on a bus and I headed to Pittsburgh, 60 miles to Pittsburgh, and I was terrified. And there were a group of us who tried to join the Marine Corps, and 4 of us made it. And so we were sworn in, and I didn't know the other guys. They were all from Pittsburgh, and they said to me, look, we're going to run over, we had about 8 hours before the train left to go to Paris Island. And he said, we're going to run over and have something to eat and a few drinks. You want to come? And I was trying to act like I knew what was going on. You know, I was watching them pretty closely, and I was trying to act like I saw the big picture. And I said, well, yes, I didn't have any other plans. And for the rest of my life, I didn't have any other plans. And so we went over to this bar in Pittsburgh. And I don't know if you've ever been in a bar in Pittsburgh, but I want to tell you about this place, okay? We walked in there, and I knew that I was in the wrong place, because this place was filled with real men. You know, the kind they had tattoos, they spit on the floor, they knew names, words I never even imagined doing, and they were just saying it. And every one of them had a real woman with them. A real woman's a woman who hangs around with real men, and wimps like me get what's left. And I sleeked over in a corner and sat down and tried to be anonymous. And the bartender came by and asked what we wanted to drink, and I watched the other guys, and they didn't even hesitate. They said, I'll have a Duquesne, or I'll have an Iron City. And I said, me too. And I think I sounded as confident as they did until my voice cracked. And then so he brought that beer, and we drank it, and I looked around, and God, what a hostile place. I mainly looked at the floor, and they ordered another one, so did I, and they ordered another one, and so did I. And then it happened. Barney talked about it. It happened. I don't know. I stood up. I don't think I meant to stand up. But I stood up, and I looked, and the floor was 6 feet 4 inches below me. I looked out, and my right shoulder was out to here, and my left shoulder was out to here, and the muscles were rippling through my body. Unbelievable. But mainly what happened was this thing went through my brain. It was boom, and all the confusion was gone, and the fear was gone, and the timidity was gone. And I took a step, and I stumbled. And the man said, "What's the matter?" I said, I think I just tripped over an invisible line. Because I know then was the beginning of my alcoholism. I know it because I used alcohol and it made me different. But that isn't what was miraculous. I looked up, and my heart broke. This place was filled with a bunch of pathetic, sniveling little men. And all of them had these gorgeous women with them who were looking at me with hungry eyes. They were saying, I'd give anything if I could have a man like that. And it was incredible because I looked around, and these guys looked so confused and so lost. And I began going from table to table trying to explain to them about what it was like to grow up, how you could be a real man. I explained to them about politics. I told them all about the Marine Corps. And time flew by, and pretty soon it was time to leave to go to the train, and they were all heartbroken, and they were frightened. And they asked me if I could please get back that way, and I told them I didn't know if I'd have time, but to hang in there and to try to live one day at a time and to let go, let God. Easy does it. And I got off to the train, and I went into that Pullman coach that I'd never been in before, but I knew how they worked. And I came through the next morning on the floor, and the train was in Washington, D.C., which was 300 miles from home, and that's 3 times as far as I'd ever been. That's terrifying. And I got off the train in Union Station, and the guys with me said, "Hey, we're going to run over to this place called the Monaco and have a couple drinks. You want to come?" And I figured, well, what do I know? I'm from out of town, and I'm 5 feet 1 inches tall, and I weigh 113 pounds, and I don't know anything about living. And so I went. And somewhere between the second and third drink, it happened again. And I made the same discovery that Barney made. My problem was I was sober. When I wasn't sober, I fit. When I was sober, I just didn't belong there. And it's all because of the spiritual illness, the terror, the fear, the blaming, the self-pity that I had. And alcohol would put all that to rest. And I went on and I did all the things. I did very well in the Marine Corps. I loved the Marine Corps. Next to the nuns, it looked easy. And really did. And I'm telling you, I so enjoyed hearing Barney talk about the spots on the soul. When I was in the first grade, we had I was in grade school. I was taught by the Sisters of the Iron Glove of Nazareth, Kentucky, and they had this little thing called the Holy Childhood. Now, a lot of you heretics don't know about the Holy Childhood, but that was where the nuns would extort your lunch money, see, until they got $5, and then you bought a pagan baby. Now, I had no notion of what the hell a pagan baby looked like. It couldn't have been good because every time they said pagan, they said it with a certain amount of disdain, and so I was real easy. So they got my money fast, and I got like $4.98, and I was terrified to give them the other 2 cents. Because, you know, I had taken home stray dogs and cats and things, and my mother did not like it, and I had no notion of what was going to happen if I took home a pagan baby. And my mother was bringing home Christian babies at a pretty fair clip herself, and I just couldn't imagine what it was going to be like. So I sort of hung around until Mary Beth got $5. And Mary Beth, I watched, you know, and I waited, and Mary Beth got $5, and they had a little party because she was the first one to get a pagan baby. They didn't give her a pagan baby, they gave her a little pin. And so I waited about another week, and the nun was bugging me about the 2 cents, and I think I bought her off with a penny or something. And then finally I went up to Mary Beth, and I said, well, how'd the family react to the pagan baby? And she said, what pagan baby? And I said, you know, the one you bought. And she said, well, you don't buy them. That's just to support them. They're still in, I think it was China before they went communist. Or it was India, right after China went communist. It was one or the other. And she said, they stay over there. They just use the money to support them. And I said, I knew that. And I was just kidding, and I'm, you know me, a kidder, and I went and gave the nun the other penny, and I bought the second pagan that year. And then I learned that my job was to be noticed, because that's what frightened people do. I'm convinced of it. I've done it drunk, and I've sure done it sober. And when I'm frightened, I need to be noticed. And when I was in high school, I discovered that one way to be noticed was to be a punk. So I began to be a punk. Now, if my family hadn't been poor, I'd have been an acting out adolescent. But we didn't have any money, so I was just a punk. And so I was doing things punks do, and I used to catch a lot of detention. And we used to serve detention in the library. And we had this beautiful human being, this woman named Sister Victoria, who used to run around, and she used to say stupid things like in the eyes of God, every boy is a prince, and every girl is a princess. And so we'd run around behind her back calling each other Princess Mary and Prince Keith and all that business. And she used to put me behind the magazine rack when I was serving my detention, because she said, Keith, you are a gift of God, but you're a rather loud gift, and his other gifts need to have some quiet, so she'd put me back there. And we used to make rosary beads. They give you wire and beads and pliers, and you make rosary beads. And for those of you who nail things to church doors and stuff, rosary beads are things that Catholics pray on, and they have 5 decades. In other words, they're broken up into 5 decades. That's 10 beads, of course, per decade. And so I'd sit back there and put 11 beads on a decade. And I did this for quite some time. I mass-produced rosary beads for the missions. And I think they went to the pagan parents of the babies we bought. And at the end of the senior year, I couldn't stand it anymore because Sister Victoria would just always run around and say, "You do such a nice job, you do such a nice job." And I couldn't let this old nut think or not know what I'd been doing to her. So I said to her, I said, "Sister, you know what I've been doing, don't you?" And she said, "Yes, I do, you sly little prince." And I said, "You know, I've been putting," she said, "I know, you've been putting 11 beads in each decade." And she said, "Do you know something? All over the world, in the Philippines, in China, in India, all over the world, people are praying extra prayers, and God is going to credit you for that." And then she said something to me that's very special. They wore these big beads so they would bang against the desk when you're taking tests. And she showed me there was a little medal, and she said it was a medal of St. Jude, who was a patron saint of lost causes. And she said, I put this on my beads, she said, a couple years ago for you. And she said, whenever I get to this, I pray especially for you. She said, because God has things for you to do and places for you to go that you can't imagine. And I'd completely forgotten about that until one day I was riding back from a hospital after I had been talking to a drunk, and I was coming across Fort Bragg, and I was overwhelmed by this sense that moment Sister Victoria was entering the kingdom of God. I knew it was true, and I just pulled off the road, and I just began to pray. I began to thank God for people like her in my life, who taught me about love when I didn't have the eyes to see or the ears to hear. And I realized how wrong I'd been about all of these people who I called stupid and weak. They were people of faith. People of faith don't need to be noticed. People of faith just do. And that's what you are to me, the people of faith. You know, I had to go many miles and cause a lot of pain before I could begin to understand what it was Sister Victoria tried to say to me. You know, that I was a child of God, and every man is a prince, and every woman is a princess in the eyes of God. And that's what makes us so special. It's the eyes of God that make us special. In my prayer, and the thing I ask the people who pray for me before I speak to pray for, is that I get a little piece of God's vision of you. And then when I look at you through God's eyes, I see a prince and a princess. And that's why after 3 or 4 holes on the golf course, we can say things to one another that people who don't have this vision can't say after 20 years. That's why it's a privilege to be one of you. You know, I went on into the Marine Corps, and I really did love it. I did very well. I won Dress Blues Award and Outstanding Man's Award off of Paris Island. I did all of these things. There's a great advantage to being small. Big people somehow think you're incompetent, and so if you do what they do, they think it's spectacular. And so I just did what they did, and they thought it was spectacular. And I really did. I love the Marine Corps. I truly did. I've been tested frequently for saying that, but I did. I liked it because I like the hard work. I like being in a different place all the time. Whenever things would start to close in on me, I'd volunteer to go get shot at and things, and people leave you alone when they're shooting at you, and I really do. And I kind of like that, but my alcoholism caught up with me there, and before the axe fell, I got out. And I went on, I worked in a steel mill for a little while, and I left there, and I ended up going to Baltimore, and by this time I was 22 years old, and I was extremely troubled, very, very, very troubled. I began then to become much more inside of myself. I became louder and what I called more outgoing, but I wasn't. I was more and more frightened, and I was more and more alone. This illness is a spiritual illness of isolation, and the longer that I drank, the more isolated I became, and the more alone I became. And I ended up living at a place called Woodstock College, which is a Jesuit theologian. It's a place where the Jesuits in the Maryland province and then went for their last 4 years of education or theology training. And there was I stayed there and worked in a laboratory, a genetics laboratory, and it was wonderful. I was tutored by some of these wonderful men in a variety of things, and I fell in love with the study of theology there, and later, after I got sober, went to the place where they invented basketball, Georgetown University, and took a degree in philosophy and theology. They don't agree with me in Indiana either. I don't understand this. We're in North Carolina. But I remember one time in particular, I had begun drinking alone, and the rationale was I lived alone. Seemed to make perfect sense. If when I was alone, I was drinking with a woman, the Jesuits would have had something to say about it on their property. So I drank alone, and I also then began wondering what it was all about. I don't know if you ever went through that phase where you began looking for meaning in all of the insanity. And one time I was strolling around the mile path at Woodstock College, and I ran into a man named John Courtney Murray, who I was told was an eminent theologian, and he looked at me, and he's a deeply beautiful man, and he looked at me and he smiled and he said, there was a path that used to go around the college, it was called the Mile Path, and people would walk and pray and meditate on that path, and he said, he looked at me and smiled and he said, I see you're contemplating the existence of God. And this rage that I didn't even know was there just blurted out of me, and I said, God, there isn't a God, or if there is, he's in Mexico and he doesn't want to get involved in my life. And he looked at me with sad and understanding eyes, and he said, son, let me make a suggestion to you. And I knew he was going to, whether I agreed or not, so I stood there. He said, if you want not to believe in God, he said, by all means, do that. He said, but then don't waste your time. He said, go out, he said, live whatever years you have and die. And he said, or, if you choose to believe in God, he said, it's wonderful, he said, then spend the rest of your life knowing the relationship you have with God. He said, but don't do yourself the disservice of being an agnostic. He said, because agnostics are saying they can't know the most important thing there is to know, and that's their relationship to God. And I said something crude or something and walked away from him. And those words lived in my heart. And after I was sober a few years and back in school, I read those words of his in what were termed the Yale lectures. And it's really true. You know, if you don't believe in God, then live whatever time you have. And if you do believe in God, then it makes sense to seek Him more than anything else. It makes more sense to seek Him in my relationship to Him than anything else. But I will not, as a human being with dignity, do myself the disservice of saying I can't know the relationship that's got to be more important to me than any other. I was like Barney. I don't think I was an atheist. I didn't have the energy to be an atheist. I didn't have the faith to be an atheist. You got to work hard to stay an atheist. I mean, you really do, because weird people around you do beautiful things and stuff. You know, there's beautiful scenery, miraculous stories happen. I mean, you got to bust your hump to be an atheist. I mean, you got to work at it. And so what I did was I stopped giving a damn, one way or the other. And that was sort of my story. I just stopped caring one way or the other. You know, I was married. I lost a wife and I lost a couple children, and they were 2 and 3 years old, and I just I wasn't fit to be around human beings anymore, and my wife asked me to leave, and I ended up living in this little dive on Harvard Street in Washington, D.C., and I used to go to the liquor store on Ontario Road in Washington, D.C., and I used to have this big barrel filled with fifths. It was 3 fifths for $10. And by this time I was terrified of everything. So I'd put on a sport coat and an ascot or a tie, and I'd go up and I'd stand by the barrel and I'd hold the bottles up and look at the light, and myself and another connoisseur was with me at the barrel one day, and I turned to the man behind the counter and I said, "Sir, is this a pretty good vodka?" And he said, "What the hell do you care, buddy? It'll get you where you need to go." And I said to the gentleman standing next to me, I said, he's having a bad day. And the man next to me said, "Indeed." And so I bought 6 bottles of this vintage stuff, and I went home, and And I also used to drink in the bootleg joints on 14th Street. Now, I gotta tell you, I am not the right color to be drinking in bootleg joints on 14th Street. And I used to go in there and make racist remarks. You know? So by this time I weighed about 180 pounds and I was yellow. And one day this big black man picked me up and he shoved a .45 in my mouth, .45 automatic. And he said, I'd kill you, you big mouth honky, but I don't want to do you no favors. And I realized that what he was saying was true. I wanted somebody to do what I couldn't do. And then they threw me out of this bootleg joint. Now I don't know if you've ever been thrown out of a bootleg joint, because they're always in the basement. And, you know, there's worse things than tumbling down the steps. When they throw you up the steps, it's awful. You go up a step or two, you stop abruptly, they pick you up, they throw you up a couple more, and by the time I got to the sidewalk and rolled into the ditch, I was thanking God that we had run out of steps. And I started drinking in the zoo. I don't know if we have any zoo drinkers here, but I a glass and I'd fill it up. Just put an ice cube in there so I wouldn't be an alcoholic. And I went down to the zoo, and I used to go to the ape house, and there are a lot of nice places. I'd recommend the ape house. And I'd go, they had bleachers where you could sit and watch the apes, and I used to go to the end because I was a shy retiring kind of a guy, and I'd sit up there and drink whatever I had in a Tupperware glass. And, you know, if you go to a place for a little while, you get to know everybody, and directly across from where I sat was a cage with an orangutan in it, and after a while, you know, we began to make eye contact, and somebody asked me if it was male or female. It's hard to tell with an orangutan, and it didn't matter because I was impotent by this time, and I used to go down there about every day, and the orangutan and I used to laugh at the people who came in and out. And this orangutan did things I always wanted to do. You know, like there'd be a family in there, a happy family, you know, the kind the guy didn't understand, and there'd be a wife and a kid, and the orangutan would pick up piles of droppings and throw it at the whole family. I used to love it. I used to give them thumbs up, and then one day, the orangutan looked at me in what I perceived to be utter disgust and sort of walked to the back of the cage, and I jumped up and began to curse the orangutan, and they threw me out of there. And I kind of consider that the end of my social drinking, because then I went home and I began to drink totally alone and completely around the clock, and I began to binge, and I still had a job, but I couldn't get there anymore. I directed genetics units at Georgetown University Hospital, and I just couldn't get there anymore. And then one day, I got up, it was the morning, and I walked into the bathroom in this little dive I lived in Harbor Street. It was underground. It was so dark even mold wouldn't grow in this place. And I went in, and I had enough pills to kill half of Washington, D.C., because I worked with a lot of physicians who noticed I had a nervous condition. I used to bang my eyes on a microscope. And it was because I was married to this mad woman, and so they gave me a lot of pills, and fortunately I just didn't take them. Once I had a little girl come up after a talk, and I said I never took pills, and she said, that's the saddest story I ever heard. And then I went in and I just decided to take them all because I knew I was going to die, because there was just no reason to live anymore. And I was given the first of a series of miracles, and a thought came to me that if I was 29 years of age, and it's not supposed to be over when you're 29, it's supposed to be beginning. And I ran out, and my ex-wife had given me a telephone number to a treatment center, and I must say, if I had not been for this place, I don't believe I'd be alive today. And it grieves me when I hear people stand up and talk about places where they took people like me to help me. I'm just so grateful. I haven't been around a long time, but I've been around long enough to remember how hard it was to get some people into hospitals and things to be detoxified. My dear friend Buck Doyle from Washington, D.C., who died this past week, had people die in his house from alcoholism because we couldn't get him into the hospital. It was so desperate to get people into places where they could get some help at one time that we used to drive them down to the White House and get them drunk and drive them down to the White House and tell them to go ask the guard to see the president, because by law they had to put them in St. Elizabeth's Hospital and they could get detoxified that way. So I'm so grateful that there are places that take people like me now, and it isn't hard to get people into them. But there was, this telephone number was the one place in the Washington, D.C. area who would treat me for what I had, and not for the fact that I was divorced, and not for the fact that I was suicidal, and not for the fact that my liver was almost dysfunctioning, but for the fact that I had a spiritual illness called alcoholism that screwed up my thinking and my view of life and everything else. And I picked up the phone and I called, and a woman with a British accent answered, and I knew I was in the right place. I knew that it would be all right, because a lady with a British accent answered the phone, and she asked me how old I was, and then she said, you know, we have a bed. It's Monday. We have a bed, and if you don't drink between now and Wednesday, we can take you. Be here at 12 o'clock. And I said, I'll be there. And I hung up the phone, and I looked, and I burst into tears because there was a fifth of scotch on the draining board. And I went over, and I knew God gave me a piece of information. He knew that if I took one more drink, I'd die this time. I knew it. There was no question in my mind. If I take one drink, I'm going to die. And the beauty of the information was knowing that will never keep me from taking it. I used to try to scare myself into not drinking. I'd go to autopsies to watch what happened to somebody who died of chronic alcoholism. Then I'd run down the bar, and I'd say, Vinny, you better make it a double. You'll never guess what I saw. And he said, we always have a double. I said, then make it a triple. I saw the worst thing, and then I'd explain to him and all the guys at the bar what I saw, and they'd all have a triple. You know? And I came to realize that I never could get scared sober. Knowing I was going to die never, ever would stop me. Because, and I came to realize that what God gave me that day was a piece of the first step. I was powerless. If I took one drink, I was going to die. I knew about progression, but knowing that would never, ever keep me from taking it. And 3 days later, somehow I got in that car, and it took me 5 hours to drive 30 miles because the horror was so great. And I got out there, I wet my pants, and I had to change my pants along the road. And I got out there, and they'd given my bed away because they didn't think I was going to show up. And I said to the lady, can I leave my car in the parking lot? And she said, yes, but why would you do that? And I said, if I go back to town, I'm going to die. And I knew it. Because I knew if I took one drink, I'd die. And knowing that would never keep me from taking it. And I thought I had to hide out in this treatment center for the rest of my life. And I know today that what God gave me, May the 13th, 1973, was true. Today, if I take one drink, I'm going to die, and knowing that will never keep me from taking it. But I can't hide out. I can't hide out. And that's the beauty of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've got to get out in the middle of things. I've got to stand up and be counted, or I'm going to die. And it's that simple. I don't question that. And that night, they took me off to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. There was a man stood at the door who shook my hand and looked me dead in the eyes and told me that if I kept coming there, I'd never have to drink again. And there was a woman who sat down next to me. She's 10 days older than dirt. And she sat there. They were all old. And she sat there and she patted me on the leg and for a half an hour and got me half a cup of coffee. And halfway through the meeting, when we had the secretary's report, this old face exploded into one of the most beautiful smiles I've ever seen. And she said, son, you keep coming here, you'll never be lonely again. And I remember I burst into tears. Because I didn't know that what I was all alone. I really didn't know that. I didn't know it. I had a beautiful wife who I could lay beside in bed and feel completely and utterly alone. I had 2 wonderful children, and I could hold them. I loved them desperately, and I was completely and utterly alone. I had everything, and I was alone. And now I had nothing, and it wasn't any different than having everything. And I began to go to meetings, and I just fell in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't think it would work for me. I thought I was different, but I kept that a secret, and I kept showing up. And I kept a lot of secrets. I was afraid to tell you that I didn't believe in God, or I didn't think I believed in God. I wasn't sure. I was afraid to tell you I was confused about that. I was afraid to tell you how angry I was about God. I was afraid to tell you how bad it was for me as I was growing up, that my problem was I wasn't loved enough, and I grew up in poverty. And if you grew up in poverty, you would have things you couldn't overcome. And it went on and on and on and on. And little by little, I began to leak this information to you. I was impotently sexually impotent when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a frightening thing for a guy who's 29 years old who doesn't feel as though he could ever be in a decent relationship anyway to be impotent. And I know a lot of men who have had the same problem. And yet I walked around and kept it a secret. And finally one day I couldn't stand it anymore, so I went to an old-timer. You got to be careful with old-timers. I don't know, it's all the cigarette smoke or coffee. Something happens to their heads. And they get insensitive, and they lose track of time and things. And I went to this old-timer, and I told him my problem, and he burst into tears, or laughter, and I burst into tears. And he said, "Oh, you got that problem, huh?" And he said, "I don't worry about it. It'll be all right." And I said, "When?" And he said, "A couple of years." I said, "A couple of years?" So I went to my sponsor, and I hadn't wanted to tell my sponsor about this because I didn't want my sponsor to think ill of me, and perhaps not want to sponsor me. So I went to, finally I went to Dan, and Dan was an interesting guy. He said to me, he said, "You know, a lot of us have had that same problem." And he said, "But for most of us, it gets better." I said, "When?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "It's different for different people." He said, "But look," he said, "you have a lot of problems, don't you?" I said, "Yeah," I got a lot of problems. He said, "You got more problems than anybody I know." I said, "That's true." I said, "Every time there's a meeting and they talk about a problem, I got it." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I've noticed that." And he said, now tell me," he said, "of all the problems you have, the thousands and thousands," I said, "Yeah." He said, "Of all the problems you have, which one is going to be more fun to work on than this one?" And I realized that what sponsors do for pigeons is they take tragedy and put a smile on it. All of a sudden, it wasn't a problem anymore; it was a challenge. And I'm here to tell you that it's getting better. You know, I was a madman when I got sober. I was absolutely mad, and there's a great love for madness in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there really is. You know, the madder we are when we get here, the more people love us. It's just true. I don't understand it, and the less of a chance you have, the more everybody pulls for you. And I was this angry person I was frightened is what I was, and I was spiritually ill, and I was fearful that it wouldn't work for me. And I'd come back and I'd challenge you all the time, and you always had these little answers for me, and you always said them with a glint in your eye and a little smile on your lips. And I remember when I looked around and I started to see the people I wanted to be like, and they talked a lot about God. And so I went to one of them and I said, "You know, what? Tell me about this God stuff. What do I need to know about this God stuff?" And he said, "Son," he said, "all you need to know is you ain't it." And I went away and I thought about it for a little while, and then he got back to me and he said, "You want to know something about God?" He said, "We'll pick you up." And we went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and we took a meeting to Howard Pavilion for the criminally insane. And we were riding back, and this man turned to me and smiled. His name was Dick L. Lives in Washington, D.C. And Art P. and a number of us went together. He looked at me and he said, "What do you know about God?" And I said, "God's the difference between me and the man I gave cigarettes to there." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Does God love me more than him?" And he said, "No. God loves us all the same." And he began to hand feed me about God. He said, "God wants him to work his will out for him there, and you're to work his will out for you here." And I began to learn these things. And I was also one of these people who suffered from intellectualization and rationalization, and I used to figure things out all the time. I spent all my time trying to figure stuff out. And I thought that for every problem you had, there was one solution, one answer. If you didn't get the right answer, a big hand came down and gave you a drink. I don't know what happened. Or you otherwise expired. I don't understand how it happened. And one day, I went to an old guy, Don Kane, who's now dead, and Don was a beautiful old man. I trusted his answer. He's a retired brigadier general, and he was wise, so I trusted his answers. And I went to him with his problem, and he said to me, he said, Keith, I don't know the answer to that. And I said, oh, no. I said, I only got a few hours to live. And he said, well, he said, I recommend it. You go down to the Metropolis Club in Washington, D.C., and then it was down by the Trailways bus station in an abandoned building, and or condemned building. And I went down there, and I was supposed to look for a particular man, and he wasn't there. And Don told me he probably had the answer. And the man was out on a 12-step call, and I waited, and he came back. And I got about an hour and 20 minutes to live. And I said, I got to talk to you. He said, well, we're going to have our meeting now. I said, it won't wait. He said, oh, you'll be all right. You sit next to me. And so when it was over, I told him my problem. I can't remember the problem, but it was a big one. I had a problem with a month club. There were a group of us used to get together and figure out what it was for the month. And I had this one real bad. And so we talked for a little bit, and he said to me, he said, you know, he said, boy, I remember he was beautiful. He was a black fellow. He had white hair. He's just a beautiful man. And he said, boy, he said, I don't know what to tell you. He said, and I said, oh, no. He said, look, he said, don't drink, even if your ass falls off. And I remember driving home, and I was thinking, that's the most profound thing I've ever heard in my life. And I suddenly realized that Alcoholics Anonymous isn't where you get answers to problems. Alcoholics Anonymous is where you get a solution for living. And the solution was don't drink, even if your ass falls off. Come back tomorrow and see how God works it out. That was the solution. And you know, and I had so many old ideas when I came here. I had old ideas about my parents. I had old ideas about God, about the nuns and the priests who loved me when I was young, about everybody, about you, about people, about the world. I had all these ideas. And an old guy told me one time, he said, look, I want you to borrow some lipstick from one of the girls in the program. He said, I don't want you to do anything else with the girls in the program, but I want you to borrow some lipstick. And I want you to go home and write on your mirror, Keith, you are wrong. And I said, I can't do that. You see, my problem is I have a poor self-image. I don't think well enough of myself. He said, borrow some lipstick. I said, okay. And now I wouldn't borrow anything because I didn't want to owe anybody anything, particularly a woman. So I went to the Five and Dime and I bought a tube of cheap lipstick. And I went home and wrote on my mirror, Keith, you are wrong. And I threw the thing in a trash can, and I knew you were all crazy. And I went to bed, and I obsessed half the night with how unfair it was. And I woke up the next morning, and I was depressed. I was trying to work up a fever so I wouldn't have to go to work. I knew I was never going to make it. I was never going to have sex again, and even if I did, nobody would want me anyway. And it's going on, and I didn't know how to do the job I've been doing for 5 years. And I went to the bathroom. I looked at the mirror and said, Keith, you were wrong. I said, thank God, if I'm right, I'm in a lot of trouble. One of the great spiritual principles. I'm wrong. I'm wrong. Thank God I'm wrong. If I had been right, it would be awful. It would be just awful. I was wrong about the police. You know, I couldn't sleep. A lot of people had this trouble. And they would say, anybody here have any problems they want to talk about? And I'd say, I can't sleep. I can't sleep. And some holy man would say, nobody ever died from not sleeping. So I jumped up and I screamed, no, you bastard, but people died from saying nobody ever died from not sleeping. And they'd say, keep coming back. So I found the solution. I was driving around one night. At night, I always drove around D.C., looked at the monuments and tried not to kill anybody. And I went to the Jefferson Memorial, and I went out and I laid down in the grass. I fell asleep. It was miraculous. I got up, I woke up, an hour later, I felt like $1 million. So I ran up home, I got my sleeping bag, I drove back down, I laid it out on the grass. And my problem was I couldn't sleep. My problem was I just didn't know where. And so I lay down, I went to sleep. About an hour later, somebody's kicking me. He said, he's a parked policeman. He said, what are you doing here? I said, I'll tell you. And I told him my story. And he said, no shit. I said, yeah. And he said, you mean this is the only place that you can sleep? I said, it's the only place. He said, I'll tell you what, buddy. He said, anytime you need to sleep, you come down here. He said, I'll tell the other guys about you. And every few days, it gets so bad, I couldn't stand it. I go down there, I roll my sleeping bag out, I lay there, look at the stars, and I'd hear, Keith, is that you? I'd say, yeah. And he'd say, how many days? 64 days. Isn't that wonderful? You want a cup of coffee? No, I think I'll get some sleep. You want us to wake you? No, I'll wake up on my own. So, don't worry, we'll keep an eye on you. Thanks. Good night, Keith. Good night. I was wrong about the police. I was wrong about Sister Victoria. I was wrong about my parents. I stopped one day and I bought I wanted to buy I lost a lot of weight after I stopped drinking. A quart a day will, put it on you, and I had to buy a belt, so I stopped at a street vendor in Georgetown and told him I wanted to buy a belt and everything, and he said, mine. I had my old belt. He said, gee, this is a big belt, and I said, yeah. I said, half of that was liver, and he couldn't leave that line alone, so he asked me what had happened, and I told him, and I told him, I said, I hadn't had anything to drink in almost 90 days. He said, isn't that wonderful? And tears came to his eyes. And he said, would you take this and carry it for me, please? And he gave me a keychain. And I thought, isn't that nice? And I carried a keychain, and I carried it for 6 or 8 or 9 or 10 months. And it dawned on me that I was praying for him, or for somebody he loves. And I knew I was carrying a message. And I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled. And thing after thing after thing happened to me. And I can't tell you, and it's all because of you. I didn't come here with any faith. I didn't come here with any trust. I didn't come here with any belief. I came here spiritually ill. I came here knowing that the world was a lousy place in which to live, and you had to get yours before they got you. And I didn't stay here because I believed it would work for me. I stayed here because you believed it would work for me. I didn't stay here because I wanted to be good. I stayed here because you saw me well. And that's why I'm here. I'm not here because of anything I ever did. I'm here because of everything you ever did. All I ever did was show up. I ended up studying in France. I was sober about 6 months. I ended up studying in France. And where I ended up living was a block and a half from the studio of a man from Kentucky, a man named Charlie B., who, as far as I know, still lives in Paris. And I, when everybody else was sleeping and I couldn't sleep in the nighttime, much less in the daytime, I'd go down to Charlie's art studio and we'd feed soup to sick alcoholics. And Charlie taught me about loving people unconditionally. I went to an first AA meeting in France, and it was in French, and I don't speak French, nor do I understand it. And yet when I left that meeting, my heart was filled the same way it was filled when I left my home group. Because what's spoken here isn't verbal. That's why I never worry about what I say. I pray for one thing, and I pray that God would have you hear what you put in my heart. Because that's what's of value here. I left that French-speaking meeting with knowledge of the love of God. And it wasn't a thing I heard. It was what you told me through French members told me. I ended up going to Rome, and I lived in a monastery for a little while, and they only had one meeting in Rome at the time, on 13 Via Napoli, and they closed the monastery up at 7 o'clock, and the only way I could get out was they gave me a key to the wine cellar. And I said to the monk, where in the hell were you when I needed you? And I would steal my way through the wine cellar and through the garden and out the back gate, and I'd go off, and you would spend time with me, and you would just love me, and you would nurse me, and you would let me go on and on and on and on and on, and you never told me to shut up and listen, because I couldn't listen. You knew I couldn't. You know that listening isn't something you do with your ears; it's something you do with your heart. And my heart was still closed, so all you did was smile and say things to me. You keep coming back. It's better that you're here. Imagine. It's better that I'm here. What a way to live your life. I was sober 90 days, and we were doing and I was feeling kind of sorry for myself because I lost my children. I wasn't permitted to see them. And we were doing a bone marrow on a woman who was crying and had just turned 30. And she was crying, and she said, I'm 30 years old, and I got this disease. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm 30 years old, and I got this disease. And she said, my husband took my children and left. And I said, yeah, you know, my wife took my children and left. And she was holding my hand. And I didn't say this out loud. I was saying it to myself. And she was holding my hand, and she said, I'd do anything if I could be well. And 30 days later, she was dead. And 30 days later, I was sober 4 months. And I came to know something about the privilege of alcoholism. I came to know that if I stay sober, if I work the steps, I'm privileged to work for God. I'm privileged to carry a message that's more magnificent than anything in the world. God didn't love me more than her. She did God's will, and it was my job to try to do God's will. You know, last year and this year, in June, I flew to Washington, D.C., and went to DAR Constitution Hall. And this past year, my youngest daughter, Kimberly, graduated from high school. And she's a beautiful, beautiful child. I got a picture. I'd be glad to show you. And I had my last drink. Kimberly was not yet 3 years of age. And I was there with my fiancée, and my ex-wife and my husband-in-law were there. And his ex-wife was there, and their children and our children were there, and only God could work that out. And I said to Julie, come here, I want us to sit in a special place. And they all sat, and I went up to where I had sat the year before. And the year before, Julie wasn't with me, and I went up there alone. And I went up and I sat by myself because I knew what was going to happen. The same thing that's happening now. Because when I saw Kelly walk across that stage and get her diploma and to get ready to go off to Duquesne University, I knew that it was a privilege to be there. And I realized that I had been wrong about my children. The job of my children wasn't to make me feel good about me. My job was to serve my children. And that's what I try to do. I try to serve them. I pray for them. I try to be available to them. Most of all, I try to live my life the way you taught me to live it. Because that's all I have to give them. In the long run, that's all there is. When they're at my house, I try to wait until they go to bed, and then I try to knock on the door. And then I say to them, do you have enough blankets? And they say, yeah, Dad. And I say to them, have you said your prayers? And they say, yes, Dad. And I say, I love you. And they say, I love you too. You taught me to say it. You know, one day I came up with something that I think is totally unique. I decided how to deal with my parents. You can use this if you want, but I want credit for it. I decided one day that my job was to honor them. You can use it. And I do. I honor them. And it's a privilege to honor my parents. It's a privilege. You know, I prayed and prayed and prayed for the ability to do a good 8th and 9th step. I prayed for forgiveness, and I'm convinced the key to this program is forgiveness. Absolutely the key is forgiveness. And I prayed and prayed and prayed, and it didn't seem to work. And one day, I decided to serve my father. And the way I served him was I no longer demanded to be somebody he never was. I wanted him to be strong and without fear. I wanted him to protect me. And that's what I wanted. And I had this bill he owed me from youth, from the time I was small. And I allowed him to be a frightened man who was doing the best he could with what he had. And that's who spiritual giants are. Spiritual giants aren't people who don't know fear. Spiritual giants are people who live with fear and do it anyway. And my father's a spiritual giant. He raised 11 ingrates like me. And you know what I did to him? I did this sober. I went back to Georgetown University and I graduated with honors. Now, if
if you play football and you're Catholic, you go to Notre Dame. But if you want an education and you're Catholic, you go to Georgetown University. And poor Irish kids who graduate from Georgetown University are the pride of their parents. And you know, my parents called me out when I was sober about 3 years. I'm not proud of this. This just happened the way it was. And I worked hard, and I went to school, and I worked full-time, and I went to school almost full-time, and I went to 10 meetings a week. And I graduated with honors and published my thesis in ethics. And my parents called up and said, Keith, when's graduation? And I said, I told them to send me my diploma. And I robbed my parents of that moment. And I didn't know it until a year later I was doing a fourth step. And I realized how I had robbed my parents. And I called them up and I made amends for the fact that I stole something from them that was precious to them. What I was doing in my rage and my anger at them was saying, what's important to you is a throwaway to me. And it's not. I aspire to be like the man who raised me. I aspire to that. And I don't believe I'll ever make it. But I pray that my children see me the way I see him. And I will have been a success. A man who says, have you said your prayers tonight? I was wrong. I was wrong. I was wrong about God. I didn't think God cared. I was like Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and mathematician. He said God created man in his own image, and unfortunately man returned the favor. And that's what I had done about God. That's why it was critical information when the old-timer with the sodded brain said to me, the only thing you need to know about God is you ain't it. Because that's what I had done with God. I'd made him in my image. I'd made him petty, and I made him never forget, and I made him fill with resentments and wrath and all that stuff. And the man was right. I couldn't know God that way. So I wanted to know God. I desperately wanted to know God. One day, I needed to know God more than anything in the world, and I put on a three-piece suit. And I went to him and I made amends to him. When you go to God after a long time, you want to look good. So I went to him, and I told him about what it was like living where I was living and doing what I had done and how I missed my children and how fearful I was that there would never be anybody for me. And I told him, I said, buddy, if you want me to be alone, if you want me to be celibate the rest of my life, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I want to enter into a partnership and a relationship with you, and I want to do one thing, and that is to serve you. I want to honor my parents, and I want to be of service to your children. That's what I want, and I'll do anything. You know, I got out my 8-step list, and the next person on that 8-step list were religious people. I was fearful of religious people. I used to say all the time, well, I don't care much for organized religion. That wasn't true. My problem was I wasn't a pope. If I'd been a pope, I would have loved organized religion. So I went down to this theologian, and there was a theology professor there, a guy I knew, and he was a young, sharp guy, and I knew he'd understand the significance of this amends I was about to make. And I looked for him, and I could never find him. But next to him, in a room next to him, was an old man who was sitting in a rocking chair with a shawl over his legs, and he was reading from his breviary. And finally it dawned on me that God wanted me to talk to him, and his name was Jim. And I went in, and I sat down in a rocking chair across from him, and I said, Father Jim, I need to talk to you about something. And I told him about the horrible, blasphemous, ugly things I had said about religious and spiritual people. And I said, I can't possibly get to all of them, but I want to get to you, and I want to make amends to you. And I told him what it was like, and I was about halfway through, and he put down the breviary, and he took the shawl off his legs, and he stood up, and this old man was dying of cancer. And he began to cry, and he put his arms around me, and he hugged me. And he said, it isn't you who owe me an amends, son. It is I who owe you one. He said, I've been a priest for 50 years. And he said, too much of those 50 years, he said, I felt comfortable. He said, I forgot what my higher power told me. My higher power told me to leave the 99 that agreed with me and to go after the one that was lost. He said, I'm sorry you had to be out there alone. And I realized that the 9th step isn't just for me. It isn't just for members of Alcoholics Anonymous. The ninth step heals the world. And that's why it's vital. We heal the world in which we live. And if we heal the world, we have a new freedom. If we heal the world, we don't regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. We comprehend the word serenity and we know peace. This isn't my program. This program belongs to the world. And the only way the world can have it is if we keep it anonymous. That's the spiritual foundation upon which the whole thing's built. But don't say my program, it's our program, it's the world's program. God gave us this program. There's no other way to explain it. There's no other way to explain why two flunks get together in Akron, Ohio. I was just in Akron, Ohio. Nobody goes to Akron, Ohio. I stayed at Firestone Country Club, and my brother didn't know what I was doing, but all the rooms were empty. And, Bill stayed there for 3 weeks after he met Dr. Bob. Henrietta Seiberling said that. It's in a congressional record where her son entered it. And I went from room to room to room to room, and so I'd be in the room Bill Wilson was in. I thank God, because it's not supposed to happen. That's what's miraculous. Don't tell me about burning bushes. Go to a meeting. Look around you. Look at the 12 steps, the most magnificent therapeutic spiritual program ever lived. A conversion kit. It is. It's a conversion kit. I'm glad I was wrong. I'm glad I was wrong about God. God loves me. I'm a child of God. I'm a child of God. I moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, a place I'm privileged to call my home now, where I registered a boat. And when I first moved, I lived in a little apartment, and I was sober about 8 years, and I was sitting on a balcony of this apartment. I'd been reading my big book, and a big book. I love Scripture. I read it before I came today. I need Scripture, and I need the big book, and I need the 12 and 12, because it feeds me spiritually. And if I'm not fed spiritually, then when I need it, there won't be any spiritual muscle there, because I came here skinny and scrawny spiritually, starved spiritually, filled with anger and everything. I was sitting there, and I was reading a scripture, and I burst into tears. I'm likely to do that. I burst into tears at supermarket openings. I'm not supposed to be at a supermarket. And I was sitting there, and I burst into tears, and I said, "Why me, Father? Why have you picked me? Why have you picked me to give this wonderful gift of sobriety to? Why have you picked me to know about your son? Why have you picked me?" And I was reminded of when I was in a treatment center, and I called this poor woman I had abused and tormented and tortured emotionally and physically and spiritually. And I called her, and I said to her, I said, "I'm an alcoholic." And she said, "No shit." And I said, "Why me?" And she said, "Why not you? If anybody deserves it, you do it." She hung up. And I said to God, I said, Father, why me?" And He screamed in my heart, "Why not you, son? If anybody deserves it, you do." I don't deserve it because I'm good. God knows that's not so. I deserve it because I'm His child. I'm a prince of a living God. It's a privilege to be among you. Thank you very much.